Good day. The last 24 hours have been much quieter in terms of the battlefronts in Ukraine. Some time ago, the Russian Defense Ministry said that Ukraine had committed its last important reserve formation, the 71st Jaeger Brigade, to the attacks in the Zaporozhye front. I'm not sure whether it has actually been engaged in the fighting so far, but if it has, it clearly has failed to make a significant difference. Rabotino remains contested, Verbovoye remains under Russian control. Ukrainian attempts to advance beyond these places continue to be unsuccessful. The situation in Piatikhatki remains as before, with the Ukrainians unable either to occupy or advance beyond that village on the east bank of the Dnieper at the far western end of the Zaporozhye front lines, and further east in the Vremevka salient area, things also appear to have quietened down after the intense but unsuccessful Ukrainian attacks of the last few days. The Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, has apparently said that the situation for Ukrainian forces in Marinka and Avdiivka is deteriorating. Now, I say this, I haven't actually seen her actual comments. I've seen reports about them which have appeared on Russian channels, so it may be that this is her particular spin. This is a spin on her words, but I think it is quite likely that it is true. It's clear that the attack in the Avdiivka area towards Opitnoye, the village of Opitnoye, the attempt to break or push back or roll back in some places the incremental Russian advance around Avdiivka. It's clear that that particular attack towards Opitnoye, this village near Avdiivka, captured by the Russians, I think back in March of this year. Anyway, that attack has been a disastrous failure. Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses. And if Hanna Maliar is saying that the situation for the Ukrainian forces in the Avdiivka area has got worse, I suspect she is elliptically referring to that clear-cut and apparently rather disastrous defeat. Now, in the Marinka area, it's less clear to me what is going on. This has been a long and embarrassing battle for the Russians. There were Russian reports claiming that Marinka had been captured in October last year, that's to say almost a year ago. It became clear subsequently that Marinka had not been captured. Then about a week ago, we started to hear reports that the situation is now changing, that the Russians are now pushing hard in Marinka, that they're gradually gaining the advantage there. This after various stop-go attempts. A few months ago, as I remember, the Russians briefly deployed the Chechen forces to Marinka, and Alaudinov, who was the Chechen commander, actually made a statement saying that the Chechens had received a personal order from no less a person than President Putin himself to clear Marinka of the Ukrainian troops and to bring this town near Donetsk finally and conclusively under Russian control. What then happened was that after the Chechens apparently did achieve some advances in the Marinka area, the fighting around Bakhmut intensified and got worse, and the Russians, after the problems with Wagner, the well-known problems with Wagner, had insufficient troops to be fully confident of holding back the Ukrainian counterattacks around Bakhmut. So the Chechen forces were redeployed from Marinka to the southern flanks of Bakhmut, town the Russians call Artyomovsk. The Chechens took control of the defenses around, in the area around Klashevka, not exclusively the Chechens, but a lot of the defenders now in that area are indeed from the Chechen forces, around Klashevka and Andreevka, another village further south of Klashevka, which, by the way, the Ukrainians claimed that they'd captured some weeks ago. This is the one village in the Bakhmut area which they did claim for a while to have recaptured, and which Western newspapers briefly said that the Ukrainians had indeed recaptured. Well, anyway, the Chechens were sent there. The Ukrainian attacks in the Klashevka area, as I've discussed many times in many programs, seem to have hit the buffers. They seem to have come not so much to a stop as a grinding stop. There's been intense fighting in this area, with the Ukrainians suffering particularly heavy losses, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. But anyway, the sum total is that the Chechens did do their job. They reinforced the Russian forces. Klashevka has never fully fallen under Ukrainian control. It seems most of the village, which is completely destroyed, is now in the grey zone, but the Ukrainians, again, have failed to capture it. And for the record, the very latest reports suggest that the Ukrainians either failed to capture Andreevka after all, despite their previous claims, or that the Russians have recaptured parts of it. There was even briefly one report that said that the Russians had recaptured the whole of this village south of Klashevka. But anyway, that is where the Chechens were redeployed to. They're formidable fighters. They were able to hold the line in this area, in the southern flanks of Bakhmut. And the Ukrainian offensive in this area seems to have failed. Further north, by the way, north of Bakhmut, on the northern flanks, it's again the Russians who have been on the attack, at least on the attack for some time now, making again incremental advances, regaining lost ground lost in earlier Ukrainian attacks, regaining what Simplicius the thinker calls the crumple zones, some of the crumple zones, and generally improving their positions around Bakhmut. There is no sign, however, and I should make this clear, of any general offensive by the Russians in the Bakhmut area. There's no sign, for example, that the Russians have any plans for the moment to advance on Chasov Yar, the next important town west of Bakhmut, which the Russians would need to capture in order to advance further west towards the next important town, Konstantinovka, and beyond that, to Kramatorsk. For the moment, no sign of a general Russian offensive in the Bakhmut area. They are defending there. They're not, so far, making any effort to advance. And coming back to Marinka, as I said, whatever plan the Russians might have had to fully capture this place using the Chechen troops was clearly called off. But over the last couple of days, last week or so, there's been a scattering of reports which suggest that the Russians have indeed been advancing and making progress in Marinka. And if I have understood the reports about what Anna Malyar is claimed to have said, then it might even be the case that the Ukrainians are now generally being pushed out of this town, and that the town will finally and fully come under Russian control. Now, as I said, this is not clear to me, and we'll have to wait and see what the Russian Defense Ministry says. Now, elsewhere on the front lines, it also seems to be the case that the Russians are continuing their slow, grinding advance in the Kupiansk area. We read reports that they've captured more Ukrainian positions in the area of the village of Sinkovka, which supposedly is now being contested and fought over. The Ukrainian troops there are apparently clinging on, and they're apparently having some difficulty getting supplies. But again, it's not entirely clear what is happening, and the Russians do seem to be advancing also around Liman, further south, and also gradually continuing their advance towards the Oskol River. Fighting continues in all of these places. It is intense, but not as intense as fighting elsewhere, certainly not on the scale of what we have seen elsewhere on the battlefields in southern Ukraine, or indeed in the Bakhmut area, where the fighting has been of a level of intensity that goes beyond anything that we have seen in any other place on the Ukrainian in the Ukrainian war. So that, it seems to me, gives us an overall picture of the situation on the battle lines. Now, there was another big Ukrainian drone and missile attack last night on Crimea. The Russians claimed that they managed to destroy all the Ukrainian drones, that the Ukrainian drones were all destroyed. There's some claims that a Ukrainian missile attack did manage to get through and destroyed a Russian S-300 surface-to-air missile battery. There's been no word about that from any official Russian source. There is a photograph showing an explosion, and Ryba, Russian commentator, appears to believe that this Ukrainian claim may be true. Ryba, however, is not always right about these things, and I've noticed that no other Russian channel or source that I am familiar with repeats this claim. So maybe the Ukrainians did manage to get another missile through and did hit another Russian position, an anti-aircraft missile position in Crimea, or perhaps not. It's difficult to say. We've had no further information about the successful Ukrainian attack that I discussed yesterday on the ship repair facility. It seems the amphibious ship that was being repaired in this facility, its repairs, it can be repaired. There is some uncertainty about the status of the submarine. Yesterday, as I was tailing off with my video, there were reports that the submarine had received only a certain amount of damage, superficial damage. Then satellite photos appeared which showed a hole in the submarine, suggesting that the damage was more extensive. Another report on a Russian channel said that the submarine was a write-off. There's been further reports that have suggested that, in fact, it was damaged but can be repaired. We'll just have to wait and see, and we'll see what the Russians eventually do. I remember that early on in the war, the Ukrainians were able to sink, with a lucky missile strike, a Russian amphibious warfare ship. It's one of their first successes in the naval war. But the Russians subsequently raised this ship and repaired it, and apparently it's back in operation, or has been back in operation. Though this was only confirmed long after. So the Russians never provide huge amount of details of these things, but overall, it's difficult to know until the Russians do provide proper information, which might take months. It's difficult to know exactly what has happened in any one of these incidents. In the meantime, there's also reports that Shmyhal, who is Ukraine's prime minister, has now made public statements effectively admitting the failure of Ukraine's offensive. Again, I haven't been able to find these comments themselves. There are reports to this effect, but they're all on Russian channels, and for that reason, I'll just note the fact that there are reports that Shmyhal has made these admissions and that he's complained that the reason for the failure of the offensive is because of tardiness by the Western powers in supplying the necessary weapons to make it succeed. But I put low reliability on these reports. I think that Ukrainian officials would probably not want to admit yet that the offensive has been an outright failure, given the effect that that would have on morale in Ukraine and on the willingness of Western governments to keep supporting Ukraine. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the overall situation on the front lines. Obviously, things can change from one moment to the next, but I think we can arrive now at certain preliminary conclusions. We only have a few weeks left before the autumn rains and the mud season closes in. The Ukrainians at one point were saying that the mud season isn't really going to affect them because the earth, the soil near Melitopol is sandy and doesn't turn to mud when it rains. But of course they're nowhere near Melitopol. They're still fighting in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, and I understand that this is still precisely the area where things become muddy during the Rasputitsa, so it's most unlikely, it seems to me, that the offensive will continue beyond the autumn rains and the mud, unless through some miracle or some extraordinary failure by the Russians, the Ukrainians do achieve some completely unexpected success, some completely unexpected breakthrough. But putting aside that now very great improbability, I think we can come to some preliminary views about the offensive. And frankly, it looks like the Russians outfought Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were never able at any point in any one of the front lines, any one of the three axes upon which they attacked, the all-important one, the Orechov axis, they weren't able to. The Orechov axis, the Vremivka salient axis, and the Bakhmut axis. In none of them have they achieved any one of their objectives. In the Orechov area, they've been stuck in the zone of control the Russians created north of the Surovikin line. They've been bogged down in endless fighting around Rabotino, which they've never successfully captured, and Verbovoye. They've never been able to push through the Surovikin line itself, much less capture places like Tokmak or Melitopol, or battle through to the Sea of Azov. And I don't think anybody realistically expects that they will do that now. In the Vremivka salient area, which might have been initially intended as a diversionary axis rather than the main one being Orechov. Anyway, they talked about advancing towards Mariupol. They captured a number of villages, and then they came to a stop in the fighting for Staromayorsk and Urozhainoe. Staromayorsk, they have never been able to consolidate control of. It remains in the grey zone. Boris Rogin says that the Ukrainians have managed to achieve full control of Urozhainoe, though they've not been able to advance further beyond that. There are several villages beyond these two villages which the Ukrainians would need to capture before they reached the fortifications of the Surovikin line, which is some distance away along a narrow road surrounded by with high ground on either side. And it doesn't look as if that's going to happen. And the supposed objective of this advance was the town of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, which the Russians are busy rebuilding, and which, of course, they captured in March last year. And they've made no progress there either. I mean, it seems to me that this axis of attack has been a failure. And then there is Bakhmut, where Ukraine has made numerous attacks ever since May. The Ukrainian offensive in the Bakhmut area began in the first week of May. At the time it happened, I remember Ukrainian officials deny that it had anything to do with the main offensive. But I have to say that I think that events have shown that, again, they will be economical with the truth. Clearly, Bakhmut was an important priority. As I have said many times, the Russian Defense Ministry, in its report of Ukrainian losses, shows that it is here in Bakhmut and in the fighting around Bakhmut that Ukraine has suffered the heaviest losses of all throughout the time of the offensive. Anyway, they have attacked in Bakhmut. The United States has been very unhappy about this. It has complained bitterly about the fact that the Ukrainians have attacked towards Bakhmut. It has wanted them to focus instead on the Orechov axis, to push through, break the Surovikin line, sever the Russian land bridge. That's been the plan that the United States and Britain adopted. They've not really been happy about the time and effort Ukraine has devoted to trying to capture Bakhmut or recapture Bakhmut. But the Ukrainians have, to all intents and purposes, ignored this advice. They've made strenuous attempts to regain ground in Bakhmut. But as I've said, they've not even managed to capture Klashayevka. And it seems that the earlier claims that they'd captured Andreevka, well, they were either untrue, or if they did capture Andreevka, that has been reversed. So, a failure on all three axes, even the one where the Russians arguably were in the weakest position, which, by the way, was the Bakhmut area. The Surovikin line in this area is well to the east of Bakhmut. It lies between Bakhmut and Popasnaya. The fact that the Russians constructed the Surovikin line in this area suggests that they were prepared for the possibility that the Ukrainians might recapture Bakhmut, but now it is increasingly unlikely that will ever happen. And of course, the Russians didn't have the time to build elaborate fortifications west of Bakhmut. Russian control of the area around Bakhmut was never fully consolidated because the Wagner forces pulled out of the Bakhmut area after Bakhmut itself was captured on the 20th of May. Important places like the villages of Khromovo and Krasnoye were never captured, nor of course was Chasov Yar further west. And the result was that Russian defenses in this area have had to be improvised. They've not had the benefit of the elaborate minefields and other structures that the Russians have been able to create in other places. But nonetheless, even there, Ukraine has failed. And it has failed having experienced catastrophic losses. Now, Yan Gagin, who is Denis Pushilin's advisor, Denis Pushilin is the head of the Donetsk regional government. I should say that to the denunciations and complaints both of Ukraine and of the Western powers, the Russians have been holding elections in the four regions. And they've also held elections in Russia itself. These are local elections. Once the results come fully through, I'll say something about them. But the long and the short of it is that Putin's party, United Russia, seems to be sweeping the board in pretty much every place. But anyway, putting all that aside, it seems that Pushilin's status is being regularized, and it will probably no longer be appropriate to refer to him as the acting regional head of the Russian-appointed Donetsk regional government, because he will be, before long, an elected official. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Yan Gagin, his advisor, his military advisor, has come out and said that since the offensive began, or rather since the conflict began, back in February last year, total Ukrainian casualties, and I stress he means casualties, are around 500,000 men. That's dead and wounded. That may be correct, who's to say? But anyway, that's the figure that he gives. And of course, as I discussed in my program 2 or 3 days ago, Putin has put Ukrainian losses at 71,000 men. So, a Ukrainian offensive that has proved a complete failure. Now, Putin, as we've discussed, has been in the Far East. He's had a very interesting and important meeting with Kim Jong-un in the Far East. Kim Jong-un, by the way, I believe is still in Russia. He's going to be visiting various plants and factories, including the Sukhoi factory, where the Sukhoi 57 and Sukhoi 35 fighter jets are built, which is located in the eastern city, the Pacific city of Komsomolsk in the Amur region. But anyway, Kim Jong-un might still be there, but Putin is now back in Moscow, or to be precise, he's back in his country residence, rather the presidential residence, Novo-Ogaryovo. He's just had a meeting of his Security Council. We've not been given a great deal of information about it, but we are told that it's all about Russia's relations with its neighboring states. I take that to be a euphemism, by the way, for the deteriorating situation with Armenia, about which more in a moment. But Putin, having met with Kim Jong-un in the Far East, having spent a lot of time in the Far East, having met lots of people there, and having given a very interesting interview to a local journalist, which I'll come to shortly. Anyway, he's apparently now preparing for a further meeting with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is currently on his way to Russia. And this will be another in an intense series of meetings that Putin is having this month. By the way, just to say, Putin is also meeting in a few days with the president of South Sudan, who is also apparently on his way to Russia. Be interesting to see what that's all about. But in the meantime, Putin is going to be meeting with Lukashenko. And obviously economic partnership will play a major role in their discussions. But I wonder whether perhaps Putin and Lukashenko are also going to be discussing battle plans and possibly the offensive, the Russian offensive, which there have been various hints that the Russians are preparing to launch before perhaps the autumn rains and the winter closes in, and which most people expect will happen in the north, in Kharkiv region, in which case, just conceivably, Belarus might have some role in it. Anyway, we shall see. I understand, by the way, that Lukashenko is being sanctioned all over again by Western governments because of his supportive role in the conflict, supportive role of the Russian position in the conflict in Ukraine, which seems, to be frank, an entirely superfluous act at this point. But anyway, we shall have to wait and see. But it is interesting that Lukashenko is heading to Moscow and he is having his meeting with Putin. And we'll have to see what it is that Lukashenko and Putin discuss. But anyway, to reiterate, the Ukrainian offensive has failed. It has failed completely. Ukraine has suffered enormous losses as a result. It hasn't dented Russian positions in any place where Ukraine has launched attacks. The scene may now be set for the Russian countermove. Ukraine is talking about a further mobilization, but of course, if it does mobilize again this autumn and winter, whatever troops it calls up, it will need time to train, even if that training is of a very limited and superficial level. It seems that most of the best people for the army, the most motivated, the younger, stronger men, the ones who'd already received training, many of the non-commissioned officers, many of the junior officers that had been built up by Ukraine in the 8 years since the 2014 fighting, and perhaps from before then. Most of them have gone. Most of them have been lost over the course of the war. Such as were left have been lost over the course of this offensive. Ukraine is bitterly complaining about the inadequacy of the training. The Ukrainian brigades that participated in the offensive were provided by the West. They increasingly say that the training was not matched to the needs of the offensive itself. Of course, if you'd followed Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, you would know all about that. He's been making that very same point now for months. But anyway, put all that aside. The fact is that if Ukraine calls up hundreds of thousands of people, it will need to train them. It's unlikely that it's going to be in a position to do so to any remotely acceptable or adequate level. It needs to equip them, and according to Putin, Ukraine has lost over 500 tanks over the course of this offensive, and maybe some of them can be retrieved and taken back to the rear and repaired, but its armoured forces do seem to be severely depleted. It is suffering from severe problems of ammunition. This is no longer even disputed or argued about. And in the meantime, the Russian build-up, the Russian stockpiling of weapons goes on. Now, there have been some very interesting Western commentaries following the meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un. And there's been two particular pieces of mythology that I have seen being circulated, or if you prefer, narrative points, which have been circulated in Western media commentary following that meeting. And the first is that the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un is a meeting of two isolated and marginalized leaders. Supposedly, Putin and Kim Jong-un are without friends, that the whole world has turned its back on them, and the result is that they have no real choice other than to meet each other and to make up and to come together. Now, I have to say that there have been many strange and bizarre narratives which have circulated in the media, in the Western media up to now. But of all of these, I think this one must be amongst the most absurd, certainly where Putin is concerned. Just a week ago, Putin and the Russians won a major diplomatic victory at the G20 summit meeting, when several of the biggest and most powerful G20 states, India, China, apparently Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, refused to support a G20 statement critical of Russia because of the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, the statement that was eventually published was seen not just as a diplomatic victory for the Russians, but as a humiliation for the West. And this is at the G20. And then, of course, a few weeks before, there was the successful meeting in Johannesburg, in which the Russians were involved, of the BRICS, where there was a major expansion of the BRICS. And since that meeting at the BRICS, Putin has had an important meeting with President Erdogan of Turkey. President Erdogan of Turkey is now openly saying that Turkey's relations with Russia must be further upgraded, and that in order to resurrect the grain deal, Ukraine and the West must take action to satisfy legitimate Russian concerns about the way in which the grain deal, the western part of the grain deal, has never been implemented. And we've also had, before all of those meetings, a big summit meeting in St. Petersburg between Putin and the African states. 17 African heads of state attended, obviously fewer than before, but the previous meeting before in 2019, but nevertheless 17 African states attended. 70 of the most important leaders of the African states attended, and they were there, and Putin had one-to-one meetings with all of them. And of course he's about now to speak to the president of South Sudan about what I'm not even going to say. Is this a person who is marginalized and isolated. I mean, this claim is ridiculous. And the fact that the Western media and some Western governments are floating this particular narrative point shows how detached from reality Western commentary about Putin, about Russia, about the conflict has become. Now, the other narrative point is that this is an act of desperation by Putin. He's had this meeting with Kim Jong-un because the Russians are now out of ammunition and they need North Korean stockpiles of ammunition in order to sustain the war. And of course, North Korea has 60 million rounds of ammunition in its stockpile. I don't know whether that's true or not, by the way. If it is a colossal number. But anyway, that the Russians are out of ammunition and that they've become desperate, and that's why they've had to turn to Kim Jong-un. Now, this claim is made a few weeks after President Biden had to admit that the United States is itself out of ammunition, with at least 155mm unitary ammunition, which is why he's been obliged to send to Ukraine cluster munitions, which American officials had previously said that if Russia used them in Ukraine, cluster munitions in Ukraine, that would be a war crime. But anyway, the United States has been obliged to send cluster munitions. We've been hearing lots of reports about Ukraine experiencing critical ammunition shortages. And we've now also had a fascinating article in the New York Times about how the Russians have supposedly managed to circumvent the sanctions. And we hear that the Russians have increased production of their missiles. They're greater now than they were before the war began. They've doubled production of their tanks. They were producing 100 tanks a year before the war. Now, supposedly, they're producing 200 tanks. And they've increased their production of shells. And according to the New York Times, the United States, the US intelligence community, believed their most pessimistic assumption was that the Russians would be able to produce 1 million shells a year, that they would be able to increase shell production to 1 million shells a year. But the Russians have doubled that. They've exceeded the worst fears of the West, and that they're now producing 2 million shells a year. And we're told that that is, well, much more than the collective West is producing. I've even seen one suggestion somewhere, that it's 7 times more than the entire West is producing. Now, I'm going to say straight away, these figures from the New York Times, these production figures, these output figures from the New York Times, they may be true. I can't corroborate them one or the other, but I suspect that they are very much on the low side, especially when it comes to ammunition production. Now, I've discussed this many times. I've covered this topic on numerous occasions. I'm not going to return to it in this program, but suffice to say that this supposedly desperate man going cap in hand to Kim Jong-un is asking for shells. His country is producing more shells than the entire collective West combined, and the collective West has, by its own admission, run out of shells to supply Ukraine. Well, the point is, the meeting with Kim Jong-un was clearly not only about shells, but let's return to it in a moment. The key point, again, is that this army that has run out of shells, the Russian army that's run out of shells, that's supposedly going cap in hand to North Korea, has just repelled the most powerful counteroffensive that Ukraine has launched against it and probably can ever launch against it. No one, I think, seriously expects that Ukraine will ever have the numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles and guns and shells for an offensive that were supplied to Ukraine by the West for the offensive that has just come and gone. So, if we take the view that shells has been a topic of Putin's discussions with Kim Jong-un, which I don't know, by the way, to be the case, but let's just assume that it might be true. The Russians have made some comments, by the way, about the fact that they're not interested in discussing their military cooperation with North Korea, with the Western powers. The West has acted with such duplicity towards them that they're not going to waste any time responding to Western claims about supplies of shells or shared military production or anything of that nature. So, it's possible that the Russians are going to import shells from North Korea. But if they are, then most likely they're doing that not because they need shells to maintain a defense, even if they are only producing 2 million shells a day, 2 million shells a year. That comes at over 5,000 shells a day, which is probably enough, but it's enough to match the most that Ukraine has ever been able to fire on any single day, except during brief periods during this offensive, this past offensive. And it's probably enough for defensive purposes for the Russian army. Anyway, if the Russians are indeed importing shells from Ukraine, it's not because they need North Korean shells to defend themselves from Ukrainian attacks. It's most likely because the Russians need hundreds or at least tens of thousands of shells, and perhaps hundreds of thousands of shells, perhaps even millions of shells, in order to go on the offensive themselves. So it would be an ominous sign, not something to cheer about. But, well, I'm not going to devote more time to it. I've already said why these two narrative points are clearly wrong and shouldn't be taken seriously. But there it is. Will there be a Russian offensive over the next few weeks? I think it's likely that the Russians will launch some kind of offensive before long. I've come very much to the view that it will be an incremental one. I think that the Russians will not attempt, at least in this offensive, to deal a knockout blow against Ukraine. I think they will push further towards the Oskol River. They might push further in the Chasov Yar and Bakhmut area. Perhaps they will try and take Chasov Yar and those two other villages, Khromovo and Ivanivska, Krasnoye as the Russians call it. Maybe they will tidy up by finally capturing Seversk and Liman, and pushing on towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And there's some hints also that they might be pushing further towards Vuhledar as well. I noticed that Vuhledar, where nothing very much seems to be happening at the moment, but the Russian Defense Ministry seems to be talking more about it. So we could see an offensive of that kind, intended to tie up loose ends on the front lines in preparation for what I suspect will be a still bigger offensive, probably next year, when the Russians have retrained all their forces, trained up all their forces, put themselves in a stronger position to go on the attack, and when production rates have finally matched the needs of this rapidly expanding Russian professional army, which I suspect at the conclusion of this expansion process will probably number around 500,000 men. Anyway, that's what I think. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, let's just go back to that meeting with Kim Jong-un. I have discussed previously in my previous program why I think this is an act of momentous significance. One commentator has made an entirely interesting point to me, which I think is perhaps a true one, which is that, putting aside the obvious advantage to both the Russians and the North Koreans of this rapprochement, one thing that might have pushed the Russians further towards doing it is the fact that the United States has brought Finland and Sweden into NATO. And given how the Russians feel about NATO expansion, perhaps reopening relations between North Korea and Russia is Russia's way of evening out the score, if you like, to that act of NATO expansion on Russia's western borders, northwestern borders. But putting all that aside, I think that this is a relationship intended very much for the long term. I think it is clearly backed by the Chinese, and I think its purpose, firstly, is to counterbalance Western American moves with Japan and South Korea in the Northeast Pacific, but also to provide the Russians with additional manpower and industrial clout as they try to develop the eastern regions, the Pacific regions. And Putin made a very interesting point whilst he was in the Far East. He said that, well, Russia has a population, a total population of around 150 million people. 40% of Russian territory is in the Far East, which is, of course, east of the Urals. This is where much of Russia's gold and mineral reserves are located. But the population, Russia's population east of the Urals is only 12.5 million. So there is a shortage of manpower to develop this region. It was a very interesting discussion which he had with a journalist, this journalist. They discussed possible immigration into Russia. Putin made it very clear that he's not particularly keen on that idea. He does not want Russia to stop being, as he would say, Russian. I think in this, by the way, he is probably supported by most Russians. But that leaves open the problem of how, in that case, do you develop the infrastructure, build up the roads, the railways, create the cities, build the factories. Well, he talked about importing labor from other areas of the former Soviet Union. He spoke at length about bringing in people from Central Asia. But of course, it makes logical sense also to look for places like North Korea, which also has large numbers of workers and which has a growing population, by the way, and make arrangements for North Korean workers to come and work in the Russian Far East, as well, the Germans would call them Gastarbeiter, guest workers, to have them come to the Far East and to work on these construction programs and establish this network of roads and railways and ports and other facilities in the Far East, which Putin clearly sees, as every Russian leader since Nicholas II, by the way, has seen, as essential for the development of the Far East, which will be the way of developing Russia as well, of propelling Russia forward over the course of the 21st century. So I suspect that manpower rather than shells was probably the priority of the discussion. Now, having said that, the other thing I would say about the North Korean-Russian rapprochement is that far from being some sort of anomaly, some sort of union of rogue states, as the West would like to think, it is actually consistent with the global trend, which is that more and more countries that find themselves in conflict with the West are increasingly coming together and forming relationships with each other that bypass the West and to some extent seem intended to shield these countries from the West. So we've seen the BRICS, we've seen the BRICS emerge, we've seen countries join the BRICS, we've seen talk about creating a global and financial architecture. We saw the events at the G20 summit meeting, which ultimately was dominated by China and India, not by the United States and the G7, as had been the case in the past. And this development of Russia and North Korea coming together is consistent with that pattern. It's part of this pattern of the world outside the West starting to rearrange itself, starting to provide linkages, and starting to develop in ways which perhaps at a time when the West was more obviously dominant would not have seemed possible. And I would say that from a North Korean perspective, this meeting with Putin, which of course in terms of Kim Jong-un's visits is a sequel to visits that meetings he had last year with the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. Well, this meeting with Putin is probably a breakthrough. And I suspect that we'll be seeing a lot more of Kim Jong-un. I suspect he'll be traveling to more countries before long, that he'll be perhaps traveling to places like Vietnam, maybe to some of the ASEAN states, possibly to India, which has had a good relationship with North Korea going back many decades. And of course also to the Middle East. North Korea has had relations with both Saudi Arabia and Iran at various times. We could start to see the North Koreans engage more actively with the world, because from their perspective, the world has become, over the last few years, less American and seems likely to continue doing so. So I think that there's been much misrepresentation and misunderstanding of this meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un. I think the overemphasis on this issue of shells, and let me stress again, I don't think there's any confirmation yet that the two leaders, Putin and Kim Jong-un, did even talk about shells. But putting that aside, this meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un, it was not just about shells. It was not primarily about shells. The overemphasis on the question of shells in connection with this meeting that one sees in the Western media is in effect a way of ignoring the much more disturbing underlying realities, which is that the world is moving on and countries are increasingly doing business with each other and forging relationships with each other and coming together in combinations which basically are a way of saying farewell to the West. So that's what I'm going to say about this. Now, since I've brought up the West, the country that still is far and away the most important Western state, which is of course the United States, it seems to me now is facing major political and economic challenges. I said a few things about the US economy yesterday. There's been more signs of inflationary pressures starting to intensify again, and I suspect that they will continue to do so. But following on from comments that I've made in previous programs, the Speaker of the House, Mr. McCarthy, has now announced the start of an impeachment inquiry of the President. It's not yet impeachment proceedings, but there's going to be an impeachment inquiry carried out by one of the committees of the House, and we will see where it goes. My own view is that people in the United States are much too indifferent or even complacent about this. A sign of the actual nervousness of the administration is the fact that the President's son has initiated some very strange legal claims against Mr. Isaac, the laptop repair person that he left, or as he would say, it hasn't yet been proved, but anyway, that a certain laptop was left with. I have to say, I find this one of the most ludicrous cases I've ever seen. The President's son is claiming breach of privacy over the contents of a laptop that he won't even admit is his, despite the fact that there is a massive evidence that it is his, and that this is no longer seriously disputed or denied by most people. But anyway, he's bringing a claim against Mr. Isaacs, which, as far as I can see, is primarily intended to intimidate Mr. Isaacs and to perhaps silence him. And of course, he's also bringing further legal claims, none of which I can understand or which make a great deal of sense to me. And in the meantime, the President's team seem to be preparing a legal team to contest the impeachment, and White House counsel has issued statements to the media, inviting the media to cover the impeachment in a responsible way, which Jonathan Turley, for one, the constitutional lawyer, is suggesting is clearly a steer from the White House to the media to basically circle the wagons around the President. The fact that all of these steps have been taken, I think shows that within the White House, they're taking this very seriously and that they are nervous about it. And if you are at all familiar with any of the contents of the laptop, if you have been following the Burisma story with any detail, and as I said, it was all set out in great detail in that recent article in National Review, then you will know that they have a good reason to be very nervous about this impeachment. If all the facts that are already known become generally known in the United States, and I can't imagine any more likely means to make these facts known than an impeachment inquiry, then my own personal view is that the President's position is going to become ultimately untenable. And we can start to see that there are more and more people, both in the United States and in Britain, which is, of course, deeply connected to the United States from a political viewpoint. Anyway, they are all becoming nervous about this and calls on the President either to step down or to abandon his plan of standing for re-election next year, that these are starting to grow. And I understand that the journalist David Ignatius has now lent his name to these calls. I understand that he's written a piece in which he also says that the President should opt out of standing for re-election next year and open the way for others to contest the election on behalf of the Democrats in place of him. And David Ignatius, who is well connected to the Democratic Party, but who is also very well connected to the US intelligence community, I am sure that he's speaking for a great many people. And my own sense is that the pressure on the President over the next few months is going to increase and grow, and I, for one, would not be surprised if at some point over the course of the next few months, probably not very soon, we do see an announcement that the President is not going to stand for re-election next year. Now, here I'm going to make a few observations, a few quick observations. Firstly, outwardly, this has nothing to do with the conflict in Ukraine. There are strong reasons why an impeachment inquiry would be launched that are completely independent of the conflict in Ukraine. The National Review article tells us what they are through its exploration of the Burisma affair, and there are other affairs also that will no doubt we will also find out details about. So this is not on its face connected with the Burisma affair. But of course there are other factors to place. Firstly, there is apparently a decline in the President's health. I've seen articles. There was one by Andrew Coburn that I discussed a few days ago, in which he said that at the NATO summit in Vilnius, European officials were shocked at the signs of the President's decline. But I am going to suggest that despite all of this, the conflict in Ukraine does play a very significant role, because it was the President, it was Joe Biden, who basically committed the United States to the as long as it takes position with Ukraine. It was he who has authorized all the various military and financial appropriations for Ukraine. It is he who has agreed to the delivery of ever more advanced weapons to Ukraine, And of course, it is he who took the key decisions to launch the sanctions war against Russia, which many are now increasingly accepting, has disastrously backfired. And of course, his diplomacy around the world has also fallen short. We saw that at the G20, where he wasn't able to get the statement from the G20 that he wanted, and he couldn't risk a breakdown of the G20 mechanism either, because the BRICS is strengthening even at the same time as the G20 has been divided. So, to a great extent, the president has invested his prestige in this conflict in Ukraine. And right at the start of Ukraine's offensive, I remember reading an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, about the fact that the president himself was nervous about the outcome, that he recognized that if the offensive failed, it would undermine his international position. And of course, though the article didn't say that, it would also, in the end, undermine his political position within the United States itself. And of course, it's now all but certain that the offensive has indeed failed. So he was right to be nervous, and I suspect he's even more depressed and alarmed by the fact that the offensive has not just failed, but as I was saying at the start of this program, it has totally failed. And those who at Vilnius noticed a decline in the president, they noticed that he appeared to be perhaps less engaged, more distracted, more tired looking. These are words that I've seen used. Well, if one understands that he was nervous about the outcome of the offensive, understood how much of his personal prestige was linked to the offensive, and had come to realize by the time of the Vilnius summit that the offensive was not going well, it becomes easier to understand why he would be looking stressed and run down at the time of the Vilnius summit. And of course, since then, things have continued to deteriorate. And we see this now in the president's behavior. I'm not going to discuss the various odd things he said in speeches, the strange behavior that he's engaged in from time to time. I think it's not appropriate to do so. It's just that it has been commented upon by many people, and it suggests to me not just a physical decline, but also, I say this, somebody who's now under increasing amounts of stress. He knows that the impeachment is going to happen. He knows about the pressure that that's going to increase upon him. He knows about the enormous risks if everything that has happened were to come to light in the impeachment. And of course, his great hope that a Ukrainian victory would secure his political position, a Ukrainian victory in this offensive. Well, not only has that not happened, but instead he's faced by a defeat and the eventual failure in Ukraine of his policy. So it's not surprising that the doubts about him are growing, that the calls for him to step down are increasing, and that an impeachment inquiry is now underway. To be completely clear, if the offensive had been a success, if Ukraine had broken through to the Sea of Azov, if there'd been a political crisis in Moscow, if President Putin had been forced to step down, President Biden would not now be under the pressure that he is under. He would instead be the hero of the hour and coasting to certain victory in the election next year. So we see that this was a gamble that failed, and a gamble that the president has no real way out of. He has no clear path back from, or at least so it seems to me. So I suspect that over the course of the next few months, we will start to see the impeachment inquiry get underway, gradually, probably fairly slowly at the beginning, because the media will not really want to cover this story in much detail, but gradually, as more and more things leak out, the inquiry will start to gain increasing traction. We'll see more comments following upon those of David Ignatius, calling for the president to reconsider his plan to stand for election next year. And I personally would not be surprised if at some point over the next few months an agreement was quietly reached whereby the president is allowed to step down. There's an agreement that no proceedings will be brought against him, and that any proceedings against his son will not be pursued too aggressively. And perhaps at that point, he will quietly exit the scene, leaving the mess in Ukraine to be resolved by his successor. That, I suspect, is where we're now heading. But of course, we shall see whether or not I'm right. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. Be more from me soon. And in the meantime, just to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, especially Locals and Rumble. You can join us, or you can support us also via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to take the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. And until then, have a very good day.